Well, hello, everybody. My name is John Barnwell, and I'm here north of Detroit with my good buddy Douglas Gabriel, also in the greater Detroit metropolitan area, the center of the universe. And today we are going to have a wonderful discussion, I can see, because the title is something that has been a core interest for both Dr. Gabriel and myself for the last 40, 50 years. And so see if we can share some leaves from the Book of Life regarding Rudolf Steiner and the Holy Grail. Hello, Douglas.
Hello there, you Grail warrior. How are you?
Oh, I'm great, thank you.
We need defenders of the Grail, not just the bearers of the Grail or the kings or queens of the Grail. We need defenders like you. That's why your Templar sword is in the back.
Yeah, well, you have to be able to walk on a blade as thin as a knife in doing one's balancing act. Rudolf Steiner once said that the Eastern presentation of nirvana is, in current parlance, is not really strictly correct. The whole idea of just voiding oneself in nothingness is not what was intended, but it has to do with finding that balance. And that's the whole secret, the fundamental secret to the understanding of the Grail. And so perhaps today we can explore exactly what are the nature of the forces and why is it that in look in any scripture or if you look in the story of the Grail, it's all in picture language. They're not giving you a series of concepts. They're painting pictures for you. And Rudolf Steiner, in his Foundations of Esotericism lecture series, lecture 17, I don't recall the date on it right now, in October sometime. But he makes the point of that we have to get from the stage of abstract thinking, which is merely a representation of one's thinking, to be able to start to think in pictures. And he said that that was what was going to be capable of building our future world. And in light of that, I'm here with Douglas, and I remember the first time we went to lunch. And while I'd always inclined to think in pictures myself, when I sat down, I realized that you did too. And it was like watching a movie, having a conversation with you. And so it's so good to have somebody that shares in that way of looking at the world. And that also brings to mind another time when I was using a healing technique that I picked up from our friend Ariel. Dear Ariel, rest her soul. But you imagine in your mind a rosebud and you transport it into the person's aura or in their being and you unfold it. And I'm sitting there doing this to a friend and nobody knows I'm doing it. I didn't say anything about it, but she was going through some challenges and I thought that this would be helpful. And Douglas sits down next to me. He goes, "Oh, a golden rose. How cool." So we're going to try today to see if we can get you to move toward that whole idea of being able to work in picture language, which is the way in which in the West, the schools in the West would present the esoteric content. And it's kind of funny because many of the organizations, Masons and all that, they work with symbols that come out of the esoteric tradition, but yet they don't know what they mean, and they'll just ascribe them as, well, that represents, and they give out some abstract concept. And when in fact, Rudolf Steiner says that they're essentially, you can look upon them as seals, and that when you are working within that realm, that you are acting on a realm of beings. And that's that whole idea of the seal, like these seals in the apocalypse, is that there's this, you're making an impression in the garment of a hierarchical being within the spiritual world. And so when you start working with that kind of thinking, and you look at the event that happened to Parsifal when he went to the Grail Castle, and he didn't ask the question, brother, what ails you, upon finding the ill Grail King, the castle disappeared. He found himself in a wasteland. So that tells you that there's something happening in the realm, the imaginal realm, the realm of imagination. That that's where the drama is taking place.
Absolutely. Every single Grail lore story is a picture story. It's like a fairy tale. And at some point, there's fairies. Oftentimes, there's a female who guards a well, and she is part of Brosiolanda, or the fairy world. Sometimes she's evil, like Fata Morgana, or sometimes she's so good that she's like Vivian, who guards a well that when the knights are vanquished, and they come to King Arthur, what does he do? He sends them to Vivian's well until the female has blessed them from this well. Now, why am I mentioning this? Because, in my opinion, all Grail lore is about holy blood. And that can be interpreted as the child of Mary Magdalene in a crude way by many people, believing that Jesus and Mary had the wondrous child, Sarah, who was a black child, by the way. And the reason they say this is because most of these churches were all founded on Celtic sites, the Christian churches, the Gothic especially, and also throughout England and throughout Europe and Northern Europe. And they were all on wells, on springs, spring wells. And these wells were the life of those who lived in that area. And there was usually a well that had been either natural or man-made about every day's ride from another well. And there were women who tended those wells. They were called the maidens of the wells. And this was an ancient tradition that went along with what was the number one tradition and the number one religious practice of many of these pre-Christian religions, was a sense of unconditional hospitality. So whatever traveler showed up at your door, you needed to treat them like they were a god in disguise or a goddess in disguise coming to your house, and you give them your last morsel of bread if that's all you have. And of course, you give them the best water you can from the best vessel you can offer it to them. So the tradition was, at these wells were maidens who had a golden chalice to offer water to the travelers, and then anything that they desired, any victuals, any food, anything that they desired. Why? Because usually near there would be a place where they could spend the night. So this was the basically unconditional hospitality institutionalized. Well, when the blood relics of Jesus, always held by the female, and that's the reason we put out this book, The Hidden History of the Grail Queens, which starts with Mary, because even the Grail stories that include Arthur are in many cases from original stories that make reference to Joseph of Arimathea catching the blood of Christ, or the spear of Longinus, the Roman centurion soldier who stabbed the side of Christ, or from anything that touched the blood of Christ, the nails, the crown of thorns, the cloth, even the cloth of Veronica. Anything that touched the blood of Christ was considered holy and was, of course, taken care of by the Marys. You could call them the three Marys, but we would probably be best to call them the Mother of Jesus. But we even have to be careful when we say that. But let's call them the three Marys, Mary Magdalene included. And so they watched over the blood relics that then became the Stations of the Cross that they created their worship service for those who were saying the rosary through intercession of Mary, the mother of Jesus. And so you have then this tradition that the spear, in many forms, in many fashions, and we can tell you in this book that I just pointed out, this is by, I wrote this book, but we wrote it because the spear of love, what we call the spear of love, came into our possession and we had to determine its provenance. And after we looked at the studies done by experts, we then tried to figure out if in history where this spear, not the spear of Maurice, not the spear of destiny that Hitler desired or that you read about in Holy Blood, Holy Grail. No, this is a different spear, but it's probably the best candidate for being the spear that stabbed the side of Christ, because it is a Roman hasta magna hasta, which means that it was a Roman centurion spear that was created in Israel. They know this because that's where they mixed meteorite with the iron to create these Roman centurion spears, and they had a special name for them. Well, this is one of those, and it's perfectly, well, it's not perfectly preserved, but it's so preserved that it had to have been held as a sacred object. So we're studying this. And so Michael McKibben, myself, John, and Tyla, and others, we all worked on the provenance of this spear, and this book tells that provenance as best as we can tell it. So wherever you want to look at the tradition, in any of the traditions, there's always a spear that drips blood. And then there's always some kind of vessel that collects that blood. It can be a platter, it can be a bowl, it can be a chalice, it can be a dish, it can be all kinds of things. But if you look into other traditions, you'll hear that it's the philosopher's stone, that it's lapis lazuli, or that it's carbon, or that it's, and then in any of our sciences today, wherever you go, you're going to find there's a key piece to anything that you're studying that people call the Holy Grail. Why? Because the Holy Grail is the most sacred thing there is. It's your blood that can be turned into the vessel to hold the I am, which is literally, hopefully, as you're spiritually developing, becoming like the model of the I am of Christ, of Jesus Christ. So as you in your blood turn into this, instead of being a chalice that sucks from the world, it's a chalice that flows to the world. It's a chalice of love that gives out love that's beyond anything you have, and it can fill you, nourish you, and nourish and fill anyone who comes within its presence. Now, that we would call being in Christened. I often call it putting Christ on the throne of your heart, and that's where your mind is. But you need the spear, because as Rudolf Steiner said, there's a Grail castle in your head, and he gives great descriptions of it. It's the corpus quadragemini and the pineal gland. He clearly describes it, the pineal gland and the interaction with the pituitary, as the Grail castle interaction in your brain. But he also says that it's in your heart. And so when you start to look deep in the heart, you're going to find all kinds of answers to what makes the heart work. And so we wrote a book called The Heart as a Supersensible Organ of Perception, because that's what the Grail is. The Grail is your I am becoming a sensitive organ of perception. And it is through your blood that it does that. And your body is the vessel, but through your blood going through your heart, a tremendous glowing energy is created called a it's a cold magneto-hydrodynamic generator, essentially, which Tyla, Dr. Gabriel, put into her books on the Gospel of Sophia in the second volume. It is clearly described in a variety of different mechanisms. And this is the Holy Grail. It is the thing that makes you like the moon. As Steiner says, the Grail has your name written on the moon, the part of the moon that you can't see. So you see just a slither of a crescent moon, and the rest of the Grail that will be filled in when it rises to become a full moon, so it can reflect the light of the sun in its whole nature, around nature. Well, we're just that little crescent. We're on the Gradualis, the path of the Grail, the slow, steady, measured path to fill up that so that we can become not I, but Christ in me. That is the nature of the Grail, and it is the blood of Christ's etheric drop of blood in each one of us that gives us the ability to ignite that flame that basically warms your blood so that it can rise into the higher aspects of your higher chakras, as well as into the realms of higher virtues, divine virtues, and your Christ himself. So really, what is the Holy Grail? It is you finding your higher self.
Yes, and in Scripture, they frequently refer to Kyrios. And Rudolf Steiner says Kyrios, they translate it as Lord. And I've made mention of this before, but since it fits the context we're discussing, I'll bring it again I'm sure there's people here that haven't caught our previous conversations. But Kyrios, that makes a reference to that idea of the Lord, the Logos, manifest, and that you have as your I am, your true I am, the actual substance of the divine spiritual beings through the agency of Christ working through the realms of the Exousiai or Elohim. And so you have that whole idea of there's a consecration of the life of mankind that occurs as a result of the transition from the ancient world into the modern world. And so if you dig deeper into the story, you find that Rudolf Steiner, through Aaron Pfeiffer, he mentions how in the court of Queen Hatshepsut, who was one of three women who actually were proclaimed pharaoh. And so that's highly unusual in the thousands of years of Egyptian history. But that she had a chief counselor whose name was Senenmut, or sometimes Senmut. But that this individual was one of the great leaders of mankind. In fact, he was a leader of leaders of mankind. And Rudolf Steiner indicated that all of the masters of wisdom and the harmonization of sensations and feelings were incarnated in the court of this Queen Hatshepsut. This is in the 15th century BC. And so you see in the spiritual science presentation of Rudolf Steiner, he talks about how the turning point of time is the incarnation of Christ, and the Spear of Longinus pierces the side of Christ and releases the blood into the earth and into the Holy Grail. And Rudolf Steiner said that what occurred, occultly speaking, when that happened was the excess egoism was given out. And it was a purification of the process of the ego for all mankind. And what is this ego? Of course, we're referring to, it's not the Freudian ego, but it's that thing that we're calling Kyrios. And that you have within you, you participate in this level of being that's much higher, although your perception of it at this stage through abstract thinking is just like an after image. It's not the thing in itself. So that when one approaches these mysteries through these pictorial images, by generating these images within your imagination, you're able to bring yourself into a more intimate relationship with the actual realm of being on which this occurs. And so that's transformative. And Rudolf Steiner says that's what's needed to be able to move into the future in a wholesome way.
Absolutely. It's a monastic thought or moral imagination that fills that vessel at first, and then moral inspiration, and then moral intuition. And as the vessel is filled, then it overflows. It spills into yourself. It feeds everyone around you. It's a beautiful thing. And the images of the maidens of the wells, and that they were sometimes considered to be fairies. And you can actually find many of the European monarchy, their houses of descent uh, are derived from Melusina or from fairies or from, Brosiolanda, or all these strange connections, so that they can have some kind of divine, uh, what would you call it, authorization for the fact that they had stolen the true life power that was given freely by the hospitality of the people of Europe, and they turned it into basically poisoning the wells, building churches on top of those wells, and denying that they were based upon the Black Madonna, which is, there were Black Madonnas with holding this child, a black child, throughout all of Europe and all the way into Asia, all the way into Ireland. So as we look at this, we're seeing that one tradition supplants another tradition, but what survives are what John mentioned. They're the images, the imaginal realm, the moral images. So when you see the picture in your mind of the Grail procession and the bringer of joy carrying this platter, and in some cases the story, because there's different versions of the Grail. So if you study all these stories and you try to make a synthesis out of them, you will become extremely confused, and you will probably forget that they came from an early Christian tradition, which we are calling in this book the Way, because Christ said, and so did his followers, they were part of the Way, the truth, and the life. And so the Way is, as we're describing this, it's the path from the Spear of Longinus, which is the protector of the Grail, a soldier like Longinus. Longinus was told in the last 2 years of Christ's ministry to follow him. And anytime he does anything wrong, tell us, and then we're going to prosecute him. So here he was, the person who was supposed to be watching Jesus Christ and turning him into the Sanhedrin, and he doesn't really do that. And then when they crucify him, they bring out another one of their grails, and that is called the Spear of Phinehas. And the Spear of Phinehas was kept in the Holy of Holies. Now, let me describe that. In the Holy of Holies were a number of things, and it was behind curtains because there was never supposed to be a physical stone temple for the Hebrew people. It was always supposed to be a tent, and it was supposed to be able to be movable. But when they finally built it as a temple, they built the Holy of Holies, and they put a veil or a curtain, and the high priest one time a year could go into it, and if he was capable, sit on what we call the Ark of the Covenant, which is really the seat of mercy, where literally the angel wings, or in this case, the angel wings of love and harmony, seraphim and cherubim, touch the high priest, who has a blindfold on, because the radiance coming from the Ark of the Covenant could blind him, and he then becomes a vessel that even speaks or hears a voice speaking through the Ark of the Covenant. Well, also in that room was the spearhead of Phinehas, which was, Phinehas used it to kill a Hebrew man who had taken a non-Hebrew wife, and that was against their law. So the Spear of Phinehas represented strict order and following the orders of the laws of Moses. And so they kept this crazy spear in the Holy of Holies. They also kept the staff of Moses, the rod of Aaron, and the third magical thing I'll talk about in a second, but they also kept a bowl, and that bowl was supposedly green colored, and it had fallen from heaven, and Hiram the first of Tyre had given it to Solomon, and they said that this was the stone of Lucifer, which in many traditions is the Holy Grail. Well, the stone of Lucifer that fell from his prideful crown, of course, is it's a metaphor, but it's not a metaphor. It's a reality. We all, through our pride, fall into believing that we are something different than the divine. And that's really quite a silly Luciferic delusion that you can have for a while. But when it comes back to it, nothing you have is yours. It's all donated by the hierarchy. We have our ability to make decisions of right and wrong. We have the tree of knowledge of good and evil, but we don't have the tree of life. But when you talk about the Grail, you come back to the tree of life, which has multiple traditions coming out of the Garden of Eden, where different grails were brought. The Zohar stone, which was a stone on the ground in the Garden of Eden that the later prophets, patriarchs, kings wore around their neck, called the Zohar, but with a T in front, Tzohar. And it was a magical stone that had magical powers. The high priests wore 12 special stones that represented the zodiacal influence, and the Urim and the Thummim, these bones, were kept inside. Where? At their heart. So you see the Zohar stone, you see the breastplate of the high priest, and Noah had the head of Adam. But the head of Adam, and it was his grail, his holy grail. It's the only way they stayed alive in the ark, was because they had taken the head of Adam, which had in its mouth, I forget, 1 or 3 seeds from the combined tree of knowledge of good and evil and the tree of life that had grown together in the Garden of Eden by the time Adam had sent his son Seth back to the garden to get some of the fruit. And this is how they picked up the Zohar stone and how they got these seeds and this apple. And one of these stories of the apple goes on that the apple stayed good for a long, 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 long time. So this going back to the Garden of Eden and coming out with the Holy Grail, this is a long, long standing tradition. Or to have the spear that is the spear of Phinehas, which represents, of course, then the Grail spear. And then the bowl of Hiram given to Solomon, well, that's the bowl that Joseph of Arimathea supposedly took from the Holy of Holies to be one of the 4 cups of the Jewish Passover feast that Jesus Christ turned into the Last Supper. So you can find these traditions going along, or also the head of Adam with these 3 or 1 to 3 seeds in it gave all the warmth and light and nourishment for all the animals in the ark for Noah. So what does this mean? Well, how could there be so many different versions of this? And I'll tell you one other version, and that's the version of Miriam. Moses' elder sister was Miriam, or she was called by the Egyptians because she was raised in the house of the pharaohs too, Juah, Juah, and she's the one who put Moses in the basket. She's the one who convinced the princess to take Moses out of the river. She watched over Moses the whole time, and she had what was called Miriam's well. Moses had the manna from heaven, and Aaron, their brother, so this is a triumvirate, like all the ancient wisdom is always a 3, so it's always a 3. So this is 2 men and a woman. But Miriam had, I'll tell you right now, something that is a shock to most people. And when they hear me say this, they think I'm a little bit out there. But what did Aaron have? He had the rod. And when Moses held up the staff, Aaron had to be there holding onto the rod in the earth, holding up Moses, holding up the staff. And Miriam was there too. So the 3 of them had to work together. Well, when they're in the desert, the rod became in the daytime, the pillar of smoke, and at nighttime, the pillar of fire. Why? It was their fire. Just like Zoroastrians at their temples always have a fire and a pool of water. So their fire was the rod. And also, where did the staff of Moses come from? A fiery bush. And then, but Moses brought manna when they're in the desert. And what did Miriam bring in the desert? She had the rock, the Holy Grail of the Hebrews. It was some kind of rock that when she beat the drum and gathered the women and they sang the song, and then they gathered the men with their rods, she took a rock, which they said looked like a beehive, and a beehive looks just like an omphalos. The Greek omphalos, which looks like a beehive, that's exactly what they describe it as. And they took this rock, and wherever Miriam said, put the rock down, they put the rock down, and then they took the staffs and they spun it around like drilling a well. And Miriam never missed. Every time she drilled, she only drilled once, and every time she hit the water. And every time she created Miriam's wells. When she died, the Hebrew people moved into Canaan because Moses had to strike the rock. Remember the story? And no one would go, what rock? Why is he striking a rock with his staff? And because he struck it twice, he doesn't get to go into the land of milk and honey. What is that nonsense? It's very clear. He took his staff trying to do magic to make Miriam's rock, which was in fact probably either a meteorite or an adze stone, a very hard stone they used in Egypt to carve other stones. It was a drill bit. It was the tip of the drill bit. There's no doubt that that's what is being described here. When you read it over with that in mind, you go, well, of course has to be what they're describing, because the second Miriam died, the well ran out of water. And Moses, it was on him to do what? So God told him, strike the rock once. What that means is drill once, because you first did what Miriam did, used the drum and the singing of the women to find the right spot. Or, like my grandpa, a dowser. She was the dowser. So Moses wasn't a very good dowser. He struck it twice because he didn't believe. And he struck it with his staff, not using the rods. And I'll tell you what the rods are. The rods, this is an amazing connection here, because the rod was in the Holy of Holies. So was the staff. And I bet you a dime to a dollar, like in every Greek temple, there's an omphalos, either outside or inside. Every single Greek temple, and most of the temples all over the Levant, and even Catholic churches, Gothic churches, have an omphalos outside. And you say, what's that? And they go, oh, that's the navel of the world. And they say, the navel of the world? What the heck are you talking about? Oh, don't ask any more questions. And don't ask about the well in the basement. And don't ask about the black woman statue with the baby on her lap that's black. Don't ask any questions. Because why? The tradition is so absolutely transparently clear once you know what it is. So Moses didn't get to go into the land of Canaan because he struck the rock twice. Okay. He didn't have faith, and he didn't do his dowsing properly, and he didn't use Miriam, and he probably just needed to let the women find the spot to drill. That's when they had to move into Canaan. Okay. They did get the water, but it wasn't a very good well. Moses died, and Joshua had to lead the people in. What was the rod? Look back at the rest of the references to the rod in the Old Testament. Each of the leaders of each of the 12 tribes had a rod, and it was a metal rod, some type of metallic rod. It wasn't wood. And what would they do with them? It creates what we know as the fascists today. They put the 12 rods together, bind them, put the spearhead of Phinehas on top, and when the ruling group, which changed its names, but during the time of Christ, it was the Sanhedrin, decided that someone had to be put to death because of their Hebrew rules. That's what they did. They created the fascists. They put the spearhead of Phinehas in it, and they stabbed the person righteously and killed them. That spearhead was coming out to the Mount of Calvary, where Christ was being crucified, being carried by the Sanhedrin when Longinus took his Roman spearhead and poked the side of Christ to show that he'd already was dead, because the blood and the water had already separated. So they wouldn't have to break the bones. So they would carry this spearhead of Phinehas when they were going to do one of their more dirty deeds, as it were. And so that is the tradition of the spearhead. But when you go back in history, all religions believed in these, either a trifold spearhead or the magic spearhead or whatever, any tradition, you will find that the spear is sacred. And the spear is usually held by the sky god on a horse. And so that would be translated into the solar god, or the Greeks' solar logos. So Christ literally needed that spear to be brought into the process as the example of the way to go from the way, the truth, and the life. So if you get into the way, you go from a guardian of the Grail to a tender of the Grail, and either a Grail king or queen, just like all the Grail stories. Or that's the way. Then there's the truth, or you can become a disciple, and you can start to preach the truth of the Holy Grail, which is the truth of the Christ, I am in your blood. Or the way, the truth, and the life. You can attain the life. You can actually attain the Grail and use that Grail to give life to yourself and others.
Yes, and all of these images, you say, well, this one says this one says the other one. When one does that, in essence, you're missing the import of the story, as they say, because the intention of these legends and stories and fairy tales is that they're meant to transport you into a level of consciousness, so that you can get into understanding that when you act, you have to understand the way karma works. That when you act, because you have thinking, speaking, and walking upright are three of the gifts that were given to us. And to understand karma, it has to do with us performing an activity in the world with the hands, so to speak. But yet, that realm is personal. But when you get into the realm of speech, when you get into conversation, which is a form of communion, then you're participating in a larger circle of reference. In that realm, you're within the group because you're talking to someone, and there's a connectivity there. But that when you go into the realm of thought, that embraces all mankind. And so to be able to take your relationship to the world of thought into the realm of these imaginations, what it does is it brings you into that larger context. And that universality for the whole earth, that's the Christ reference, the Christ consciousness, so to speak. And so the path of the Grail is gradualis. Rudolf Steiner said Grail is gradualis, which means gradually. And so to be able to gradually move from the realm of taking the abstract, faint reflection of the world of thought and be able to transform it through imagination to develop a relationship to the life of thinking. And that realm is the realm of the second logos. That's the realm of Christ that we can approach through language. And so when you get into understanding your personal relationship to all of this, it involves a meditative content on these images, like, to let them work in you. And that's why so much is given in scripture in picture language, or myths, fairy tales, all the sagas of different lands. They're pointing towards giving one a context in which one can maintain a relationship, at least a memory of the supersensible.
Yes, oftentimes we forget the female that is connected to the Grail, and we forget that Mary herself, the mother of Jesus, certainly would have been given everything that had his blood on it. And then when we started looking at the provenance of this spearhead that was found in Antioch during the First Crusade, it started to make a lot of sense that, of course, she would have been the guardian. And now the debate is the following: did Mary stay in Jerusalem and stay at what was called the upper room, or now they call it the cenacle? Or at one point it was called literally the Priory of Zion. It was the priory of the fathers, the desert fathers of Alexandria and of Egypt, who had come back. They came back a couple times. And of course, that was where the Last Supper was performed. It was where the Essenes met when they were in the city. And it was also the tomb of David and other people. And it was near the Palace of David, so it made kind of sense. But basically, you could say that it was the first Christian church. And at the same time, it was a Christian synagogue church. And so people reported that they had seen the spear of Longinus and the crown of thorns there. And this then opens up the question of, did Mary stay in Jerusalem for the 11 years after the crucifixion? Or did she, like other traditions say, move to Ephesus after passing through Antioch and then moving to Ephesus? And Peter himself and Paul worked out of Antioch quite a bit, which was near to Ephesus. And there's a tradition of the Church of the Apostles staying at the cenacle, at the upper room. And there's the tradition of the Desert Fathers. And there's multiple traditions of holy grails that were found, or grail blood relics, the nails that nailed Christ to the cross, the things I mentioned before, the clothes, the crown of thorns, even the chalice that was used, because what did he say? This is my body, this is my blood. So whatever was holding that wine, then was holding the blood of Christ. And this is what supposedly made it sacred. And then Joseph of Arimathea, being a member of the Sanhedrin and their tin trader, they're one of the richest people in Jerusalem at that time, had access to the high priest and supposedly brought this chalice out of the Holy of Holies that was given to Solomon by Hiram. And others say it was given by the Queen of Sheba to Solomon. But one way or the other, it was used because they have different chalices or cups that they use for blessings during the Last Supper, being, of course, a repetition of the Passover service. So then Joseph of Arimathea went to the Mount of Golgotha and caught the blood of Christ after Longinus speared his side. Well, Rudolf Steiner points out that that blood was the thing that transformed the whole earth, and it went into the etheric body of the earth, and therefore goes into the etheric body of every human when they're born, as well as it stays in the earth and is the redemption of the earth. But some of it was caught supposedly by Joseph in this grail. And this becomes strange because the water and the blood both came out, and some say Joseph had two vials. He caught the water and the blood. And also Christ's circumcision skin also, as well as other things, that anything that had to do with blood and Jesus was considered sacred. And why? Well, the Greeks believed that the ichor, I-C-H-O-R, the divine nature of the blood of gods sometimes was passed to their children, as the gods had relationships with humans, and that blood was passed on to them, which gave them half immortality. It's the blood that gave the Greek gods and goddesses immortality. It is true they had to eat ambrosia and drink nectar, and the Norse gods had to eat the apples of Iduna, and there's the soma of the East. So they had a certain food, and that's why we have now the Grail communion, because really that's what the Eucharist is. The Holy Eucharist is a replication of the Grail mysteries. And Rudolf Steiner pointed out that some anthroposophists will be into the cosmology, as John and I are talking about, these cosmological aspects. Other people will be into the devotional aspect of it, and that's it. They can go to any church, and if they're doing the Eucharist, that's it. That is the transformation, the transubstantiation of their own I am into their higher I am, the monastic principle, or we'll call it Steiner's names, spirit self, or monastic principle, life, spirit, and spirit self. That's what you're getting out of that communion. We gave up the blood sacrifices with Abraham when God told Abraham to sacrifice his own son Isaac. Well, he didn't. All around Abraham, in Chaldea, in Babylon, human sacrificing was absolutely common. They believed in Moloch. They sacrificed babies. They sacrificed humans, and they certainly sacrificed their enemies and slaves. And so it was the transformation from blood sacrifices to the redemption and the ascension process that happens in your blood, because the blood is how you ascend. It is through the silica in your blood, the iron in your blood, the oxygen, all the metals and minerals are actually creating this ability for blood flowing through the heart to create a fantastic amount of bioelectric energy. And you could say, oh, that bioelectric energy is the overflowing of the Grail. Yes, it is. But it isn't, one isn't the other. And it's just, they're connected, but they aren't the same. The spirit part is first, not the physical part. Though we can describe through all the ancient traditions exactly how this happens in the spiritual practices of morality that can get this to happen in your body, so that you open up that Grail so that it starts to overflow to others instead of selfishly flowing into the black hole of your heart. It becomes an ion jet coming out of a galaxy, which then what happens when you have supermassive black holes that suck everything up? Stars, millions and hundreds of millions of stars. Where do they go? Nobody knows. As I always say, we told you a long time ago where they go. It's a child should be able to figure this out. And then in every single formed galaxy that has a supermassive black hole or an ion jet, what they now call relativity jet, the relativity jet spins out hundreds of millions of stars out of the center of a galaxy. Where did they come from? That's the breathing process of the heart of a galaxy. That's the same thing that happens in the human heart. Our heart is a supersensible organ. It perceives interior and it perceives the exterior. And what rules the whole thing are the concepts that you have. That's why you have to start the path of the Grail off as a guardian of the Grail. You have to have awe, wisdom, reverence, devotion, loyalty, honesty, truth, love, beauty, goodness, all that. You have that, and you're defending the Grail. And pretty soon, you'll get to tend the Grail. Why? Because that's all you're thinking about is higher virtues. And so you will live in that realm. And then after that, you will be given the challenge that Parsifal was given, or many others, every great hero or heroine. And when I say Hercules, I mean Hercules was actually Heracles, was female to begin with, and was probably Psyche. So Psyche and Eros, that's probably the story of Hercules, but told in its original form. So male or female, it doesn't matter. You have to go through these processes, and then you're given the challenge, as John said. Do you have the right question to ask at the right time so that the failure of the previous king of the Grail can be rectified? And remember, it's the male line, the queen of the Grail, and the female tenders of the Grail, they weren't wounded. Only Titterel, only the old king, only the king of the Grail that is wounded, that has caused the entire land around him to become a wasteland. And that's what we're trying to get out of these images, is what is the true core of what is being said here. And when you get that, it's like my studies of comparative religion. I found that every single valid traditional religion or mythology points at the same exact thing, and that's the golden rule. It's as simple as that. Love yourself, love your neighbor as yourself, and love God. It's real simple, in, out, and above. And that's what the ego can do. The ego, your blood, can determine what's going on outside of you in ways that we don't even understand yet, and inside of us. And it creates a giant torus field of energy. And when it comes near somebody else, they interact. And so we're working on resonant vibrations that are really the word of God. And before you get to the word of God, you have to understand the harmony of the spheres. And before you get to the harmony of the spheres, you have to stand what John was just pointing at, the pre-earthly deeds of Christ, standing upright, speaking and thinking. And then the next deeds of Christ are complete redemption and the gift of our I am independently. And then that is then added to by the gift of memory. And so memory is really the Akashic records. And who tends the Akashic record? The Lord of Karma, Jesus Christ. So when we're talking about the Grail, we're not talking about a pagan path to images that you can't understand and traditions and lore that you don't have time in your life to study, because John and I have spent our life studying these things, and you can't synthesize it and understand all those traditions without anthroposophy. And who can study anthroposophy these days? But when you do, then you will arrive at the same thing that Tyla Gabriel arrived at, which is the Gospel of Sophia. You will arrive at the processes, both physical, emotional, spiritual. You'll arrive at a cosmology that explains the whole thing as it descends and ascends. You'll arrive at the ability to develop a language of the spirit. John was making reference to that from the beginning. The language of the Grail is his book. If you want to understand the Grail, study the Arcana of the Grail Angel. It is literally the most comprehensive condensation of Grail wisdom that you can find anywhere, any place, in any tradition, and certainly in a single book. So, and particularly the charts in the back, these are the symbols and the images that you will find again and again in the Grail lore. And it's completely Christian, because without Christianity, if you said, what's the number one thing Steiner did? His Christology. He is by far the greatest Christologist of all times, and he rectifies so many of the different dissents and the heretics that have arisen within Christianity. If you study his Christology, then you will not only be able to answer who were the Grail maidens, what was the Grail, what were the blood relics of Christ, but you'll also be able to understand the whole descent of your I am, your ego, and how it is to ascend and what that process is all about. And that is truly the process of the Holy Grail.
Yes, to enter into the service of the Grail. St. Paul in 1 Corinthians 6:12, he says, everything is permissible for me, but not everything is helpful. Everything is permissible for me, but I will not allow anything to control me. And so there you have basically, you have the golden rule, and then you have what St. Paul just said there, is that can you be as Parsifal, be without guile? I mean, that's kind of an obscure word today, because people are not as literary as they used to be, but to be without guile is to not have an agenda. And in order to be in service, you have to get past your personal agenda, because ultimately the Grail represents creation out of nothingness. And there's something working that is beyond the realm of personal karma, that you're allowing the world of grace to be a realm in which you're participating in the manifestation of. And that's the whole point of someone like, say, Buddha, who translates to the realm of nirvana. What does that mean? He has found the equilibrium so that he can get beyond just creating personal karma. That's a tremendously profound concept. And so when you look at, for example, dig into Buddhism that Dr. Gabriel is so knowledgeable about, but you have those elaborate drawings that the Tibetans, the tankas, as they're called, and they'll have all this scene of activity and these little squares that represent the skandhas. And what's the point of all that? And if you get into like Manichaean lore, and it's very, very artistic, it's the point is to be able to convey one into the realm of imagination. And that's how one can work with the images of the Grail. I remember one time, it was back in the 80s, I took a nap in the afternoon and I awoke, and there was a procession of Grail maidens coming in the room, with the one in the front holding a chalice, and they're all solemn, and they're just like kind of, you know, I could see them definitely, but I could also see through them, and I couldn't really tell how many, because as it moved backwards, you know, they became more and more faint, and it startled me, and then it dissipated. And so these things live. And to enter into the realm of living thinking, sometimes things can happen where that realm reaches out to you.
Oh, yes. And the Grail Maidens, really, when you think about it, it is the womb of the woman that is upturned to the incarnation of the spirit. It is the blood mysteries of the female that continued on with the blood mysteries of Mary and the reverence of Christ's sacrifice of his own blood. So there are literally physical manifestations of this. And when you look into Tantra, Buddhist Tantra, Indian Tantra, if you look into Shakti and Kali and all these different female mysteries, what will you find? You will find blood mysteries. You'll find it as understanding of birth, death, and rebirth, which is what we're supposed to be working on as our mysteries of this particular time in evolution. So when you say blood mysteries, there are many people who've written books about this child that Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus Christ, had with Mary Magdalene, who I pointed out was called the Wondrous Child, or Black Sarah, because she was supposedly black and was female, and she came to Marseille with the three Marys after the other Mary, or the mother of Jesus, as she should be called, died in either Jerusalem or Ephesus. Now, there's a very good reason for that. And there's a very good reason why it became desecrated as the progenitors of the royal houses of Europe, the monarchies of Europe. Why? That is degeneration into the wrong type of blood worship. Instead of worshiping the spirit that flows on the blood, they were worshiping lineages. And they have became so degraded and so mythological that when you really look back far enough, it's just simply the survival of the fittest. It's whoever they sent out to battle in one-on-one combat with the other tribe. I mean, that's really what the monarchy of Europe is all about. But then they claim that they have divine right of kings, that God spoke to them. See what they're saying? I have the blood. Well, no, if you had the blood of Christ, then you would understand the language of the Spirit. Well, I do. I'm a holy monarch, and I have the blood of Christ, because literally the House of Hanover, the House of Savoy, the House of the Merovingians, they claim to have direct blood lineage of Jesus Christ. So they say then, oh, we have divine right of kings. God speaks to us. You can see how this is a wooden puppet, a caricature of what should be happening. And you get then what you get instead of a priest king, because to begin with, it was all priestesses. Then it became priest kings. And then it just became kings. And then those kings were nothing more than who was the most violent, vicious, and could undermine and conquer their enemies. And that's basically what we're still living in. We're still living in the idea that the Grail maidens have been, their golden chalice has been stolen, their well has been poisoned, and they have been raped. And that's what we have as our modern physical world, is a depredation of the woman's ability to have children, procreation. So you can take some of the Grail and turn it into anti-Grail. For instance, the Grail of our modern times is graphene oxide. Why? Because it's anti-life, it's anti-biological, it's anti-everything, but it has the capacity to do miraculous things. And what's it made of? Carbon. And what does Rudolf Steiner say? The stone of the philosophers, or the philosopher's stone, which is, of course, the Holy Grail, is what? Carbon. But if you take carbon and you make man-made carbon, you create subnature, you create anti-Grail influences, which are extremely male-dominant, conquering, aggressive energy, which we really should be getting over that by now. That is so childish that we could even consider a World War III shows that whoever's in power needs to be taken out of power, and that we need to go back to the rule of the day in the ancient Grail time, which was unconditional hospitality. Which I love. And I got to thank that concept. The first time that I ever heard it, I thought, oh, yes, because you see, Odin used to come down as the Grey Wanderer. And you might know him because one of his eyes were poked out, so he had a patch over his eye. And he always liked to wear gray. But he would come and he would visit people's homes. And it was the greatest honor. Now imagine that. God comes to visit. Hello? Is that not what Jesus Christ is? God come to visit your heart? And he already gave you an etheric drop of blood that could transform your blood into a vessel to hold that. I think that's the same tradition, but one's pre-Christian and one is after Christ.
We have the Albigensians, the Cathar, and they would have a meal, and anytime they had a meal, they would have an empty chair in case the master would come to their repast. We have from Novalis here Friedrich von Hardenberg, the great German Romantic poet. And he says, and I quote, "Blood will stream over Europe until the nations become aware of the frightful madness which drives them in circles. And then, struck by celestial music and made gentle, they approach their former altars all together, hear about the works of peace, and hold a great celebration of peace with fervent tears before the smoking altars." Now, to kind of give us a summation in the Foundations of Esotericism, that same lecture 17 from October 12th, 1905, He says, and I quote, "When man develops further, when abstract thought itself develops to the stage on which the beings are incarnated who work with us when we speak, then he is a Chela, an occult pupil. To be a master means to work in the substance in which the beings are incarnated who work with us and our thoughts. Imagination gives the picture. This is why the great religious teachers of earlier times spoke pictorially, for imagination gives the picture, not abstract thoughts. In all religions, teachings were expressed in pictures. At first, the picture is for man something of lesser importance, but when he understands how to form, again, for himself, a picture out of every thought, then he has reached a higher stage. This is the prerequisite for a quite new kind of perception. Everything depends on a man developing to the point at which he no longer thinks merely abstractly, but at all times has his thoughts in pictures." And so that basically sums up the quest of the Grail. And I just can't thank you enough for all showing up here. And Dr. Gabriel and his dutiful, unrelenting queen of effort, Tyla Gabriel, that they've done so much, and so much is available for free even. Below on YouTube, there's links to get free digital versions, or you can order the paperback versions from over on Amazon if you'd like to have a paper copy like I do myself. And so all those links are below. And also, I still have copies of my second book, which has the full series of the Grail diagrams and many additional ones from my other volume that's reprinting. But on eBay, you can get the second volume, Arcana of Light on the Path. There's a link below. Or if you're outside the US, you can contact me through my academia link below or through private message on Facebook. And also, if you're interested in buying me a cup of coffee for my efforts, that's paypal.me/John Barnwell 888. And I put all the, so many links below. Douglas and Tyla, they just have a panoply. It's a cornucopia of web presence here that you can reach so many facets of this story that we've all been working on with Michael McKibben and many, many other people. It's just really a communion of effort that's all coordinated by Tyla Gabriel. But I also want to be saying very thankfully that this podcast has been made possible by the generous support of Tyla and Douglas Gabriel and Vadim and Vivian and Neil and Tim and so many other people. And it's getting to the point to where it's too many names to read, but I love you all. And I want to thank you all for showing up. And I can see that we're just getting started. Thank you, Douglas.
Thank you. I salute the Grail in you, my brother.